in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with Sapio with Buck Joffrey. And today we're going to go back to some of the basics here. I don't know if they're basics, but we're going to go back to some viewer questions, some interesting ideas, just to talk about health and some of those things that are out there that people have questions about. Okay, here we go. So the first question is, everybody talks about overweight, obesity. Nobody talks about the quote-unquote lucky people with a decent weight, like you and I. Surely lots to talk about, but I have a very specific question. What is an acceptable and healthy range in your weight? It changes day to day. So what's acceptable? Okay, well, so this is a very complicated question. By the way, I should point out that I'm personally, I don't know if I'm necessarily one of the quote unquote lucky people, because if I start eating some pasta and stuff like that, I just, I get kind of fat. But I'm not now. But so I don't know if I'm lucky, but I work at it. That's for sure. But okay, so let's talk about this whole weight thing. You raise a good point in asking this question, because, there's supposedly like some weights that you're supposed to be, and you're not supposed to be higher than that. And maybe you don't want to be underweight too. But the reality is there's not a really good answer here, right? People talk about, body mass index, and that's usually what's used to define whether somebody is overweight or not in loose terms. And the problem with that is it's not a very good way of identifying whether somebody is overweight or not. Okay, here's how it works. Okay, you can go through the numbers with me yourself if you'd like, but for body mass index, what you're supposed to do is first you take your weight in pounds. Now, I'm 220 pounds. You measure your height in inches. I am 76 inches, so I'm 6'4", 220. Doesn't sound like an overweight person necessarily, right? Okay, then you take your height, you square that. Basically, you multiply it by itself. For me, that ends up being 5,776. And then you divide your weight in pounds by your squared height in inches. So that for me is 220 divided by 5,776. And then you take that number and you multiply it by 703. That puts me at a BMI, body mass index, of 26.77. And when I go look on the scale there, underweight is BMI less than 18.5. That's not me. Normal weight apparently is from 18.5 to 24.9. And I don't qualify as normal weight. Overweight is 25 to 29.9. And again, I am at 26.77. So by BMI, I am overweight. Obese is a BMI of 30 or more, by the way. Now, so again, by this definition, I am overweight. And while, admittedly, I might have hints of dad bod going on here, I am not really overweight. In fact, I've gained about 5 pounds of what I think is pure muscle over the last couple of months from lifting weights. So BMI, again, is kind of useless. And really, weight is kind of sort of meaningless too, because you are not taking into consideration a lot of things. Specifically, you're not taking into consideration muscle mass, bone density, overall body composition, racial and ethnic differences. These things all make a difference, right? So, and in terms of fat, it's not like looking at how much fat you got. It doesn't take into consideration where it goes. Fat actually weighs less than muscle also. And if you go back to my podcast on metabolic syndrome, which I highly, highly recommend, because that is such a major, important concept, metabolic syndrome. You'll hear me talk in that podcast about the difference between subcutaneous fat and visceral fat. So subcutaneous fat, that's the type of fat that lies under the skin. It's what you can pinch around your body, right? So you can grab it. You can grab a big piece of fat, just kind of hold it off. You can tell it's fat. I used to be a liposuction surgeon, as I mentioned before, so there you go. This is what liposuction can target, and it looks bad, and it's, that's why, and it's easy to get to, so it makes for an easy cosmetic procedure. But the thing about subcutaneous fat is it's actually really helpful from a health perspective because it allows people to store extra calories in a more benign way than the other kind of fat, which is visceral fat. Now, that's the type of fat around your organs. Think of the beer belly, rock hard, can't pinch, but sticking out. That's visceral fat. And the problem with that fat is that it secretes chemicals called cytokines near the organs that cause inflammation. And that inflammation ultimately is one of the main causes of diabetes, just insulin resistance in general. You don't even have to be full diabetic, but insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease, right? All these narrowing of blood vessels, all that stuff starts with inflammation, and cancer. Okay, so that's like sort of like adding all of these risks from visceral fat. So you could have two people with the same amount of fat, but one with visceral fat, and that person will be much more likely to develop disease. So again, what is that BMI really telling us? So apart from this eye test and various body ratios that you can really look up to estimate visceral fat, one tool that also is available to assess where and how much fat you have is called a DEXA scan. I'm getting a DEXA myself next week. I've never had one before, but I think it's worth getting a full body DEXA. So DEXA scan provides detailed images of body composition, essentially including fat distribution, muscle mass, bone density. So if you think about it, if you're actively working out and if you're trying to get in better shape, a full body DEXA scan is going to be a heck of a lot more useful than just jumping on a scale. I mean, if you're just building muscle, the DEXA's, the scale's going to tell you you're just gaining weight. So anyway, my plan, if you're interested, is getting probably a DEXA every quarter, especially since I've really ramped up my weight game. As you can tell, I am massively muscular right now. Just kidding. But I hope to get there soon. Bottom line is, I think it would be silly to assign an ideal weight. That's the answer to my question. There are just too many variables. Okay, let's see. Next question is from John Babb. He says, just listened to your podcast on male hormone replacement. I have been hesitant to try this secondary to the potential increase of cancers. What are your thoughts? Well, John, I get the concern. However, here's what I'll tell you. I've reviewed the literature on this topic a few times, and I got to tell you, I see no evidence of increased risk of cancer with testosterone replacement in men. I just don't see it. And then I don't see it in HRT in women either, other than some of the old kinds of hormone replacement that they were using. They don't really use anymore. Now, in terms of men, again, there was some old data that was suggesting maybe there was a link between prostate cancer, but that was replaced by better data, and now really there's, again, no real evidence of that. And while I can never say for sure, and I'm not giving you any advice on this, that there may not be an increase in risk from something over time, I would definitely not shy away from testosterone treatment myself because of the fear of cancer. Why? Well, I was thinking about this not long ago because I have a friend, the relatively new friend of mine. He's totally ripped. And he showed me pictures of himself in grad school, and it was unbelievable. He looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. He clearly had lots of fat, including visceral fat, and looked downright unhealthy. Back then, apparently, his testosterone was like 100, which was less than his mother's. And for reference, a healthy level of testosterone, different people tell you different things. It's probably around 600, although many doctors don't start treatment until it's symptomatic and a couple hundred points less than that. So there are lots of symptoms of low testosterone. There's, including low sex drive, erectile dysfunction, tiredness, brain fog, and those can be pretty subtle. And sometimes guys think I'm just getting older and that's why this happens. And then they get on testosterone and boom, they completely get energized, and feel a decade younger. And so that's awesome, right? And that's all great reasons to potentially get on testosterone. But here's another thing that I want you to think about as you ponder this whole question about cancer, okay? To me, testosterone is not just about symptoms. If you have low T, look back at my this example I was giving with my friend. This guy back then clearly had metabolic syndrome. Again, metabolic syndrome, we just talked about it. It's the source of a lot of disease, right? Increases the risk of diabetes mellitus, coronary vascular disease, cancer. Here's the thing. There's a study that showed that each increase of 1 standard deviation of total testosterone level was associated with a 57% reduction in the risk of receiving a diagnosis of metabolic syndrome. Higher testosterone levels were associated with higher insulin sensitivity as well. The bottom line is, what that's suggesting is that if you do take this testosterone, if you need it, if you're running low, it's going to decrease the risk of metabolic syndrome. It's basically decreasing. It can help decrease that, what they call the central adiposity, basically that fat that's kind of sitting in the middle of your abdomen. So, based on this, I'm going to say something that I don't think most doctors will say. I think that treating low testosterone only when it's symptomatic and not when the numbers are low is probably not forward thinking, because it's sort of like the same reason we talk about treating cholesterol very aggressively. We know it causes heart disease. So why wouldn't you treat low testosterone aggressively as well? If testosterone replacement indeed decreases the risk of metabolic syndrome, it stands to reason that it decreases the risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer in men. I mean, to me, honestly, again, this is not medical advice, but it's kind of a no-brainer. And here's some other good news, and that is that there is, one of the things that kind of sucks about testosterone, or has sucked about testosterone, is that when people take it, you have to inject it or, put these little pellets in or whatever. But there's now a new form that you can take in a pill. It's called Kyzatrex, Kyzatrex. And obviously I have no financial gain from Kyzatrex, but people ought to know about it. Talk to, your doctor, urologist, whatever, because a lot of people are loving it and you don't have to inject yourself. It's easy. So I think, again, if I had low testosterone, I would be supplementing. I have no problem with that at all. Okay. Next question. If you move to a new country, how long does it take for your circadian rhythms to align again? This is from Phil. Okay, well, this is actually kind of a similar question to something that I did a show on, which was like several weeks ago. You can go look it up, but it was on melatonin and jet lag and stuff like that. Adjusting to a new time zone, to a new country is, it's hard to generalize a little bit because, every country's in a different time zone, right? So it involves a process of resetting your body's internal clock. And that internal clock, as you referenced, is known as a circadian rhythm. And you want that to align to the local time wherever you live so that your body is in touch. Now, that circadian rhythm basically is this internal clock. It's located in an area called the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain. That is, suprachiasmatic means above the chiasma. That's a little bit extra neurosurgery of me to talk about, but the optic chiasm is where the optic nerves cross each other in the brain, and the right above that is the area called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And that's where the circadian rhythm is generated from. And that's important if you think about it, because you're getting a ton of visual input from where those optic nerves are crossing. So anyway, there's again tremendous influence of visual input into the circadian rhythms. Okay, so you get these adjustments to new time zones, but they can vary depending on a lot of variables like the number of time zones crossed, individual differences, even the direction of travel. But okay, the rule of thumb, if you want a rule of thumb here, is it typically takes about 1 day per time zone crossed for your body to adjust to a new local time. So if you're going like 7 time zones away, it's going to take like 7 days, which is kind of crazy if you think about it, because boy, that takes a long time to adjust. And if you're not moving, you're just going on vacation. That's why it's not always all that. That's why it's always kind of a pain in the butt. So what are some other factors that go into this stuff? Well, the direction of travel does make a difference. Traveling eastward, now think about this, it's where you lose time, right? It's harder on the body than traveling westward, where you gain time. And that's because, frankly, it's usually easier to extend your day than to shorten it in terms of your internal body clock's ability to adjust. Other things to think about here that might help this quicker is exposure to light. As I mentioned earlier, exposure to natural light is one of the most powerful ways to adjust your circadian rhythm. And so exposure to light in the morning can help advance your body clock. So again, that's useful when you are traveling east. And while you are traveling west, you may want to delay your body clock and get exposure to evening light. And that again can delay your body clock. So again, I don't want to get too complicated here, but some rules of thumb, right? If you're traveling east, you want to speed up your circadian rhythms to align to that. Then try to get some light early in the day. If you're traveling west and you're trying to align to that, get some light later, in the day, so that you're getting light before it's dark, and that extends, it basically extends your circadian rhythm. Hopefully that's not confusing. But there's other things you can do. Lots of physical activity when you get there, stuff like that. The other thing I've talked about before is the use of melatonin. And again, I would refer you back to the entire melatonin podcast that I did. But bottom line is, the melatonin is a hormone released by the pineal gland, and that's really driving this whole circadian rhythm thing. And, it basically makes you sleepy. It comes out, it's called a vampire hormone, and it makes you sleepy. And if you basically want to get to the point where that melatonin is coming out when it's supposed to in your new time zone, right? So using melatonin to adjust your new time zone, I think, is a very useful thing to do. I'm not recommending anything. The doses are usually a little high in commercially available melatonin. I think they're like 5 milligrams, and you only really need about 1. The idea there in general, and I've done this before myself, is to take melatonin the first 5 evenings of a new destination, like an hour or so before you want to go to bed. And that actually, I found that very useful when I went to Asia over the summer. So that's basically it. But to answer your main question, basically it's 1 day for every 1 day for every time zone. That's technically how long it takes, but you can do lots of things to speed it up. Okay, next question. This is from Anonymous again. There is a lot of hype about the risks of cell phones. What's myth versus reality? How about earbuds? And then bonus question, he says, how about wearable devices? And, basically how safe are those two as well? Okay, so this is a good question. Actually, this is something that I had been thinking about, for almost for over 20 years, for like 25 years. Why? Because when I was in medical school, actually, I was doing research on brain tumors, and I ultimately ended up in neurosurgery from there. And I remember my, cell phones weren't real big yet. This was right around 2000, 1999, stuff like that. And But my neurosurgical professor, whose lab I was working in, was very concerned that there was going to be an increase in brain tumors from use of these cell phones. And the primary concern on cell phones is whether the non-ionizing radiation that's emitted by these devices can essentially contribute to mutations and ultimately cancer development, particularly brain cancer, because you're putting these phones next to your head. And here's the thing. There's the data on this is not as robust as you would think. And I think the big reason for that is that you just need huge amounts of studies, lots of power. And I think it's very difficult to get that. However, I will say that there is enough data for me to be very concerned about it. In fact, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IARC, which we've referenced below, in 2011 had actually classified this kind of cell phone radio frequency electromagnetic fields as possibly carcinogenic to humans. Now, this classification was based on an increased risk for glioma, which is a malignant type of brain cancer associated with wireless phone use, observed in some but not all studies. Okay, so this is, in my opinion, this is real. Okay, it's interesting to me too, because I remember thinking about a couple of big people in a couple of big senators died within a year of each other. The same thing. John McCain, Teddy Kennedy, both died of glioblastoma multiforme. And all I was thinking to myself is, man, I wonder if it was because they were sitting around using their, cell phones all the time. But who knows? We'll never know. But I'll tell you, as a former neurosurgery guy myself, I do think this is a real thing. And I personally would, keep it away from your head. So what do? I think it's an issue of distance from your head. So when I'm on the cell phone, I'm almost always using it on speaker. That's what I do. Now, what about headphones? So wired headphones absolutely do reduce direct exposure to the head because, again, you're allowing the user to keep the cell phone away from their bodies during the call. And effectively, that serves to distance from the actual source of radiation, which is a cell phone, and it's not near your head. Wireless headphones are tricky. I've thought about this too, and the thing about it is that this is why I tend to use speakers instead of wireless headphones for phone calls, is because wireless headphones, like Bluetooth devices, they allow users to keep their cell phone away from their head and body. However, they also themselves emit radio frequency radiation, even though I will say that is a lot lower than the phone itself, right? So Bluetooth devices operate at power levels that are much lower than cell phones. And because of that, they're generally considered less of a concern in terms of radiation exposure. And, the consensus because of that among health organizations is that the level of radio frequency that, the radio frequency energy produced by Bluetooth devices is actually, significantly lower and probably is not currently, linked to any health risks. But again, if you want to talk about being, on the side of maximally safe from these things, what I would say is, as much as possible, talk on a speaker, use a wired headphone. I think if you're running around with Bluetooth stuff, I don't think you're in imminent danger, but personally, I would think about minimizing that. I still use my Bluetooth on hikes and stuff like that, but that's all I use it for. Otherwise, I try to limit that as well. Now, what about wearable devices? Because that was the bonus question. Again, wearable devices emit much lower levels of radio frequency radiation than cell phones. So right now, the consensus among health organizations, again, is that the low level of radio frequency radiation that's emitted from wearable devices is probably unlikely to increase the risk of cancer. But bottom line is, I should say there's really limited direct research on wearable technology, including cancer, right? So, most of the research that is around is on cell phones. And so a lot of this stuff, I think you kind of just have to use your head and just try to, in my opinion, minimize the use as much as you can. I don't think personally that the wearable devices are probably that problematic, but on the other hand, it's like, do you need to have it on you 24/7? I don't, I do keep my Oura Ring on me, but the Oura Ring runs even on it collects data even when I'm on airplane mode. I don't keep my phone on me 24/7, but that's because generally I don't like the way it looks. So anyway, hopefully that is helpful. And that's it for the questions this week. And that's it for this episode of Sapio with Buck Joffrey. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thanks for listening to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. A quick reminder that while I am in fact a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe. Until next time, this is Buck Joffrey for Sapio with Buck Joffrey.